Welcome everybody to the Beyond Nuclear webinar on tritium. This is the first of two in a series looking at what happens when tritium is released into the environment, both the aquatic environment and also into the air. In the second part of this series, which is not, we don't have a date yet, but we will be doing it later in the year. We're going to look more at the environmental justice aspect of this, including the potential release of 1 million tons of radioactive water, predominantly tritium, from the stricken Fukushima Daiichi nuclear site in Japan into the Pacific Ocean, which obviously affects people's health and livelihoods, and of course the marine animals as well. And also the threat for 100,000 curies of radioactive vapor, which is threatened to be released from the Los Alamos National Laboratory. So tritium is also produced in the nuclear weapons sector, and this has implications for the indigenous populations around there. So that'll be part two. But today we wanted to sort of set the scene really to talk about what tritium is, because here in the US, we also have the threat of tritiated water being released into our waterways. Most specifically today, we're going to be looking at the Hudson River, close to the Indian, which is where the Indian Point nuclear power plant's located, and Cape Cod Bay, where the Pilgrim nuclear plant is located, both of which are closed and undergoing decommissioning. So we have three wonderful speakers here today to walk us through what tritium is, how it gets into the environment, and why it is in fact harmful, and what we can do about it in order to stop these tritium dumps. Just from the logistical point of view, so you know how this is going to go, we'll have each of our three speakers speak first, and then we will choose some questions from the Q&A to give to them at the end. So please put your questions into the Q&A. If you have a specific speaker who you want to address your question to, you can note that, but we will throw it open, obviously, to all three of our speakers. And also the chat is disabled, so no need to go there. And the raise hand is not a function that you need to use either, because we will be selecting and reading the questions from the Q&A. Feel free to put your questions in anytime, and we'll be looking at those during the course of the presentations and asking them at the end of the three presentations. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our three speakers in the order in which they will be speaking. First, we have Dr. Ian Fairlie. Ian is a radiation biologist, but first and foremost, a citizen scientist. He has degrees in chemistry and radiation biology, and his doctorate at Imperial College in London, UK, was on radioactive waste policies. He was chief scientific advisor to the British government's former committee on the radiation risks of internal emitters. He is a vice president of Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, also known as C&D, and a consultant to NGOs and nuclear activists, both here and in Europe. And you can visit his website for more information. It is ianfairlie.org. You can see the spelling of his name on the screen under Ian's wonderful picture. So please visit Ian's website. Our next speaker is Mary Lampert. She's the executive director of Pilgrim Watch regarding the now closed Pilgrim nuclear power station located in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Mary also is a member of the Massachusetts Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. She has served on numerous panels and engaged in multiple proceedings and litigation, challenging the Pilgrim license extension. Pilgrim, of course, is now closed. She also served on the President's Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, focused on spent fuel storage. And Mary's website is pilgrimwatch.org. And Michel Lee is an attorney by training. She works in a pro bono advocacy capacity with environment, energy, and public health policy groups. She serves on the board of Nuclear Information and Resource Service and also co-chairs the New York Metropolitan Region Fossil Fuel Nuclear Free Committee of the Sierra Club, NYC chapter. And she recommends you visit NIR's website, which is nirs.org. So welcome to all three speakers. And now we will begin with Ian Fairlie's presentation.
Can I start now? First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, Ian, and we can see your slides beautifully.
Linda, before I start, since there are many, many Americans listening in today, I'd like to explain that I've lived in America and worked in America, studied in America. In fact, the very first woman I met and fell in love with was an American, and in Port Huron, Michigan, long time ago. So I'm not quite an American. I am actually Canadian, but I have very close connections with the United States, and I hope to be returning to visit the United States later this year. Right. With that preamble, let's go into tritium and why we should be concerned. Well, first of all, what is tritium? Well, tritium is the radioactive isotope of hydrogen. It's got a half-life of 12.3 years. It's a beta emitter with an average energy of 5.7 keV, which means that it is not an external hazard, an internal hazard. The beta particle, which is emitted when tritium decays, has a very low range in cells of about 0.6 of a micron. A micron is a millionth of a meter, which means that it is dangerous when it gets inside the cell. I'm going to try and get, yes. Actually, I can't get to the bottom of my screen, but not to worry. On to the next slide, which shows you what tritium is. Tritium consists of 2 neutrons and a proton with an electron spinning around on the outside. That is a tritium atom. And this is another illustration of the same thing. 2 neutrons and a proton with the electron cloud roundabout. Now, when tritium decays, you have and this is a very schematic diagram for all radioactive decay. You have the radioactive particle being emitted along with energy. And the two, both the particle and the energy, are termed quote unquote radiation. That's what happens when tritium decays. Now, in the environment, the most common form that we see tritium is tritiated water vapor. In other words, it's ordinary water is HHO and tritiated water is H3O, HTO. And where one of the hydrogen atoms is replaced with a tritium atom to get HTO. Unfortunately, we can't hear it, see it, feel it, or smell it. And in fact, tritium is very hard to detect. If people are thinking about, well, what is water vapor? Well, all you have to do is look out your window and look at the clouds, and you'll see their frozen water vapor. And it's not liquid. It's the clouds are in fact suspended frozen particles. Here's a water molecule. The central red blob is oxygen, and it's formed with 2 hydrogens at an angle of about 107 degrees. So that is what water is. And with tritium, one of these H's is replaced with the tritium. So we get tritiated water. Now, the brief point is that radioactive water isn't very good for us. When we are mostly water, 66% of us, our body weight is, on average, is water. And our bodies avidly take up water by breathing it in or drinking it or eating it in food and by skin absorption. And our bodies cannot distinguish HTO from ordinary water. As a result, radioactive water is carcinogenic, teratogenic, and mutagenic. It's a rather nasty customer. Why is tritium contentious? Well, the thing is that tritium is produced in all nuclear reactors in very large amounts. both in the fuel and in the coolant world. And the reason is because tritium is an activation product and a tertiary fission product. And the final point is that there is a shed load of studies implicating raised childhood leukemias near nuclear power stations throughout the world. Roughly speaking, about 60 studies have been made into this phenomenon. And there's no doubt in my mind that amongst kiddies who live near nuclear power stations, there's raised incidences of leukemia. Next slide. And here's another reason why tritium is contentious. These are existing limits for tritium in drinking water. As you can see, Canada has got its ridiculous limit of 7,000 becquerels a liter. A becquerel, by the way, is 1 nuclear disintegration per second. So with Canada, in a liter of water, you've got 7,000 of these disintegrations going on every second. In the United States, the current EPA limit is 740. In Europe, it's 100. But in Ontario, the limit has been recommended twice, is 20. And in Colorado, 18. And in California, it's 15. Unfortunately, I cannot see the bottom of my screen for whatever reason. So I'm just guessing what it says there. Okay, if we look at why tritium is a major problem, well, the main problem is because it's very easy for us to get tritium by breathing it in, inhalation, by eating it in food and drink, and by skin absorption. It's the only radionuclide that has this unique ability to get into us extremely easily. This doesn't happen with cesium or strontium or carbon-14. It certainly happens with tritium. Now, there's these are 9 hazardous properties of any radionuclide, okay? Very quickly, large releases. Secondly, rapid transport and cycling. Highly soluble. Tritium not only is soluble in water, it is water. 4, many environmental pathways to humans. Very rapid exchange rates, which means fast intakes. Very high uptake to blood after you've taken it in. You have organic binding, you get organic to get OBT, long biological half-life in human. If it's attached to your DNA, for example, it's your lifetime. And long radiological half-life, 12.3 years. Now, tritium ticks all of these boxes. In other words, it is, in my mind, and after Kirchner, the author who set out these 9 properties of radionuclides, he also thinks that tritium is the most dangerous radionuclide. And if you look, as I say, as you look at these 9 properties, you get why tritium is dangerous. Now, I want to briefly explain to you what this phenomenon of molecular exchange. We're in the realms of quantum mechanics here, quantum physics. These are models of water. I've got a picture here in front of you, and I hope you can see my my cursor. This is the oxygen and 2 hydrogens. Okay. Now, what happens is that the hydrogen atom on this molecule swaps position with this one, with this one, with that one, and each swap takes 10 to the minus 16 seconds. It's, in other words, virtually instantaneous. Now, what does all that mean? It means that tritium gets everywhere. As soon as you get a little bit out, it spreads everywhere in the environment. I mean everywhere, because everywhere there's in the biota, There's water in the atmosphere, there's water in us, there's water in food, there's water in the rain, and water in plants. It means that tritium contamination is widespread whenever you've got a large source of tritium, like near a nuclear power plant. This exchangeability here is very difficult for people to grasp. Let me explain to you that all atoms have this, no matter what kind. It's just that with tritium, or with hydrogen, it is the smallest atom there is. It's only got 1 proton and 2 neutrons. That's tritium. And so that means that this swapping going on is much more of a problem with tritium and hydrogen than any other kind of atom. It's true, for example, that this oxygen here will swap with this oxygen, but the swap takes about 1 billion times longer. With tritium, it's instantaneous. Now, let me give you a practical example of that. A long time ago, when I was at university, we were using, in the days when people didn't think tritium was dangerous, yeah, a long time ago, myself and a couple of colleagues from Imperial College, we were going to use tritium as a radioactive tracer to measure how quickly a particular stream was flowing. I'm cutting out a lot of aspects of the story just to get to the real part of it I want to get to. Anyway, amongst our team, there was a wiseacre, a wise guy who was always clowning around, Frederick, and he's no longer with us, so I can pass on this anecdote, and he would have agreed to it being passed on anyway. And he decided that he was going to go upriver and see how fast the river was flowing upstream. Just larking about, and he found tritium upstream. What on earth was going on? It should go downstream, of course. Well, this is the reason why. It's because of molecular exchangeability. It was going lightning fast upstream. So that was the day we learned not to use tritium as a tracer. In fact, nowadays, put it this way, in the 1970s and 80s, when I was at university, tritium was widely used as a tracer. Nowadays, it's not, because people realize how dangerous it is. Okay, that's enough on that. So these are tritium's unusual properties. It's extremely high mobile, as I said, it's exchangeability, and it binds with organic materials inside us to form organically bound tritium, OBT for short. Got a very short range in the cell, so it depends exactly where it is, because where it is where the disintegration takes place and where tritium's energy is deposited. It's often described by people who don't know any better as a weak emitter. But if you know anything about radiation biology, weak beta particles are, in fact, 2 to 3 times more dangerous than strong emitters. In fact, if you take a really strong emitter, like, say, for example, potassium-40, it's got an energy of about 20,000 keV, not just 5. It means that when it decays, and we have got some potassium inside us, K40, it means that energy from that decay travels right through the body and out of the body. Okay? I'll repeat that. The potassium-40 in our body, when it decays, 99% of the energy of the beta particles leave our body because it's so energetic. Whereas with tritium, it's the exact opposite. All of it stays inside the body, and how dangerous it is depends on where it is. If it's really close to a part of the body which is highly radiosensitive, for example, bone marrow, then it's dangerous. The problem with these properties is that there's no official recognition for tritium properties anywhere, apart from one UK publication in 2007, which I'll come to. There's no recognition given to any of these properties. So the end result is that official dose models for tritium are haywire. They're just not worthwhile looking at. They don't take into account any of these properties. Here's an example. This is a slide from an official document from IAEA working group in 2007 in Romania. It doesn't really matter, it could be anywhere. This is the River Danube, in short, and this is a power station called Chernovoda. And basically, this is a model when 1 terabecquerel of tritium is emitted, it was released, and they modeled what happened over the next 24 hours. And as you can see, that close to the plant, you get these very high doses, and further away, you get less. This is what happens when the wind is moving from the southeast to the northwest. And it's a very strong wind, as you can see, it's very direct. Now, you may say to me, well, all what you're saying, Ian, is all very true, perhaps, but have you got any measurements of this? This slide shows that we do have measurements. It shows you at the bottom the distance from a nuclear generating station. That's on the x-axis at the bottom. And in the y-axis going up shows you the concentration in air. And it shows you that the closer you get to the nuclear power station, the higher the levels of tritium in the air. Okay, these are actual measurements. That in this case, they're taken from the Canadian power station because that's where the data is. And over here, it shows you what the range of values is in Ottawa. This is about the background here. Now that's the tritium measurements in air. How about tritium in food? Well, here we go. Again, on the x-axis shows you how far away from the station, and on the y-axis it shows you the concentration in various media: soil, vegetation, and food. And as you can see, in fact, in this case, it's logarithmic. Although this is linear, because it's log-log, the actual relationship is exponential. You can see that the closer you get to the power station, the higher the levels of tritium in this week. Here, for example, vegetables, fruits, and cereals. So I'm not making it up. These are actual hard data. And in other words, we've got hard evidence showing that tritium is dangerous. Now, about 5-6 years ago, 7 years ago, I wrote an article in the Journal of Environmental Radioactivity. And I'm aware that most people don't read the Journal of Environmental Radioactivity, not quite you would call bedtime reading. But what I did was that I put out an article explaining why there were childhood leukemias near nuclear power plants. Okay. This was printed in the journal, pages 1 to 8, and it was the first article, because the editor of the journal believed me. He thought I was absolutely spot on. He made me promise that I would reply to what he thought would be an avalanche of angry readers saying, no, this cannot happen. And as I promised, I would do my best to answer them all. And the funny thing is that there's not been one single complaint or objection to my article. And that's a little short of amazing, but I should explain that this was very, very, very thoroughly peer-reviewed by people who didn't want this article to be published, but it was published. So here are a pile of reports about the tritium controversy. Notice this is just not me, although I have said quite a bit about it. The best report is this report here from 2007. a UK review of risks from tritium by the then outfit called the Health Protection Agency. And it was the advisory group on ionizing radiation, an official UK government body. And they reviewed it and they basically said what I've been saying. But there are other, Mackie Jenny has written, also just recently written a more recent book about this. It's very good. I would recommend it, but I've also written as well. Now, I'm time limited, so I'm going to say thanks very much and answer your questions later. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Thanks very much, Ian. We appreciate that. And just to reiterate, if you did join us a little bit late, we have 3 speakers today, and we will be taking the questions after all 3 of them are have finished speaking. So our next speaker is Mary Lampert. I'm going to ask you, Mary, to unmute yourself first so that we can hear you. And I'm going to endeavor to load Mary's slides. So just bear with us. We have had a few glitches, so this may take a moment, but hopefully not too long. And so I will get those shared for you. So let's see. So you should be able to see them. I just need to change the view. And slide only. All right, so hopefully everybody can see the slides. Mary, can you see your slide?
Yes, I can. And if you'll move to current status, the next slide would be great. Hey, there we go. Look, thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Fairlie. That was a very, very valuable presentation for everybody. Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station is in the process of decommissioning. It is owned by Holtec, Pilgrim, and Limited Liability Company, which is key. The same as Indian Point, Oyster Creek, Palisades. This is a company that had never decommissioned before. However, it's making it one of the focuses of its business. Pilgrim closed in 2019, and it was, as I said, sold to Holtec Pilgrim. The important point is Pilgrim is located on Cape Cod Bay. Cape Cod Bay is a semi-enclosed body of water with about 300 miles of coastline. So anything that is released is not flushed out immediately into the ocean. Instead, it lingers in the bay, working its way around the shoreline and taking 10 to 2 weeks to finally get out into Massachusetts Bay or into Cape Cod Bay. This is a very important body of water. It was declared a special ocean sanctuary, and for the communities that are located on the bay, it is the key to their economy. That is a healthy environment equals a healthy economy, which is exceedingly important. It is this epicenter of the aquaculture industry in Massachusetts. The oysters grown in my bay, Duxbury, are served in the finest restaurants around the country. You've all probably heard of Wellfleet Bay oysters. There's fin fishing, there's recreation, tourism. You get to housing. Realtors have already testified to the fact that they've lost sales because people are afraid of what will happen to the value of the property if there is a release of 1.1 million gallons of radioactive and chemically contaminated waste dumped in the bay. there are two identical water discharge permits that were issued in 2020. And because the EPA permit was issued in 2020, it also has a portion of about decommissioning. It says very clearly that Holtec cannot release water from the spent fuel pool or other decommissioning waters. And it's an identical permit with Massachusetts surface water discharge permit. Holtec wasn't happy about that, and there were letters and exchanges with the EPA and with the state. Oh, but you don't understand, this is processed water. It's the same as you could drink it, and they went on and on and on. Finally, they understood no meant no. There could be no discharge of that water due to the permits. So as a result, Holtec, March 31st, 2023, applied to modify its permit, which would require that they test the waters to be discharged and make public that report, and also do testing of the receiving body of water. In the interim, EPA required Holtec to give a 90-day advance notice if for some reason they intended to discharge any of the water before they were authorized under the modified permit. This is important because it would allow the state and other independent bodies to have the time to go to court to explain and request that they not be allowed to do it until there was a court process. In the interim, we're now involved in another challenge to the permitting. The challenge being to how the water in Cape Cod Bay is classified. Currently, we believe it is not classified at a proper high level, which is very important because the classification of the water will determine how robust the review of their application is. Next slide, please. We believe that dumping is clearly illegal and that the fight to be won will be in court, which fortunately, we believe the Attorney General of Massachusetts is preparing for a court battle. Our new governor, who had been the former Attorney General, has said essentially over her dead body will they release into Cape Cod Bay. There was a license application fight way back when Entergy was filing its application to sell to Holtec. Motions were filed by the Attorney General and by Pilgrim Watch. And unfortunately, before any papers were really filed, other than the motions to intervene, NRC approved the sale. Anyway, there was a settlement agreement signed by Holtec and the Attorney General's office, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And very fortunately, Holtec's lawyer must have been asleep because they signed an agreement that all applicable environmental and human health-based standards and regulations of the Commonwealth would be followed, which is key because fortunately there are many state laws that say they cannot dump this 1.1 gallon of radioactive and chemical water into the bay. And one of the laws is more explicit and said, no agency, department, governmental group can pass and agree to dumping if it conflicts with the Ocean Sanctuaries Act. Now, as I said in the beginning, Cape Cod Bay is designated as a ocean sanctuary, protected ocean sanctuary, and so therefore it falls under this act that says no commercial waste can be dumped into a protected ocean sanctuary, i.e. Holtec, you can't do it in Cape Cod Bay, and neither EPA, DEP, any other agency, XYZ, can allow the dumping that would, in fact, not be in accord to the Ocean Sanctuaries Act. There's also the Endangered Species Act. Cape Cod Bay is, I would say, filled with right whales presently feeding. You can see them feeding right off of the nuclear reactor. We also have endangered birds like the piping plover and the least tern, which is not a very complimentary name for a tern, but that's neither here nor there, and turtles. And the Endangered Species Act says that you can make no alterations to the environment, and that includes putting toxic or hazardous waste. Then there are a third one, crimes against public health, which we call the gum wrapper law, that says you cannot throw a gum wrapper into a water body. And so we've talked to fishermen, and they've said, look, we can't throw a beer can in Cape Cod Bay. How can Holtec think it can put 1.1 million gallons of contaminated water into the bay and not violate this act? Next to last, the oil and hazardous waste. And then there's Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, which is one of the most famous sanctuaries in the world. And this is 6 miles off of Cape Cod. And the important point about that act is that it says that there can be no discharge beyond the boundaries of the sanctuaries that would enter into the sanctuary. So we have these laws, and activists are also, like in New York, filing for more laws in the legislature now. And so word to the wise, I'm sure Michelle will talk later about it. You maybe have environmental laws like this in your state that you can be relied upon to use. We had a settlement agreement that said, as a contract, Holtec will abide by those laws. And so that alone would negate arguments of preemption. Next slide, please. But it has been made clear by the U.S. Supreme Court that preemption is not something that gives the federal government complete control of all things nuclear. I know here, and I'm sure in New York and other states, when you're trying to get legislation passed, their lobbyists always say, put the fear of God into the legislators. Oh, you can't do this because the NRC is the last word, and it preempts anything that you would pass on the state level. However, there have been 4 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. In all 4 cases, the industry argued that federal government preempted anything the state did, and in all 4 cases, they lost. Those are the cases that you would want to rely upon and summarize to educate your legislators. The main points that you get from those cases is number one, NRC does not control the whole field, especially it does not control, for example, economics. And again, as we say over and over again, the key to our environment is, rather to our economy, is a healthy environment. And dumping tritium certainly does not add to the health of our environment, nor does dumping chemicals, which EPA is focused on, allow a healthy environment. And as we've seen by scholarly literature, that the combination of chemicals, metals, tritium, other radionuclides interact, that must be considered. And the interaction means that the damage is magnified. Plymouth University in the UK has done a lot of experiments on the interaction between tritium, metals, particularly copper, zinc, P23, and I can't remember all the rest. But I have a whole list of those studies if anyone would be interested in them. So preemption is something the industry will throw in your face, and it does not hold water. Next slide, please. That's just a picture. Next slide, please. To wrap up, we have focused on it's illegal. The main point, obviously, is the damage to our economy, our health, and our ecology. In Cape Cod Bay, because it is a confined space, there is all the opportunity for tritium and the other bad guys to get into the sediment, and from there to work its way up into marine life. It is a recreational bay, which means kids are swimming in it all the time, and they can be exposed in the water through their skin. And I know we eat seafood, clams, oysters, mussels, what have you, 3 or 4 times a week that is coming out of that bay. So we get it internally, we get it externally, etc. We obviously need protection. We know that tritium cannot be filtered out. And I suspect that's why the industry is spending so much time trying to explain that tritium is harmless, nothing to worry about, because they know no matter how much they talk about, we will be processing this water, that they cannot get the tritium out of the water. We also know that the contamination bioaccumulates, and there's been a lot of tritium and other substances that have been released into the air. We know from meteorological studies that the wind blows a little more than half the time from the reactor over the bay, and we know the rain and stalling. So it has brought that tritium down, and it is already in our bay, and then it would be added by the release. We know in New York, during license renewal, the Attorney General hired Dr. Bruce Egan to do a meteorological study of what happens to the wind, the releases from Indian Point. And he pointed out that no, it does not go through the mountain. that instead the river captures the releases and it flows down and is trapped in the Hudson River. That will be a good point for folks in Indian Point to look at. It's Dr. Bruce Egan. It's in the license renewal litigation, and I'm sure you'll find it very useful. Again, our economy needs protection. We focus on economy, although of course it's the human health that we care about and our ecology. But we're very conscious of the preemption argument, and the economy is clearly the area that is carved out for state control. So again, thank you. And I'd also add that in discussing the impacts of releasing 1.1 million gallons, we recognize that perception is a key factor, that arguing whether X amount is too much, where Y amount wouldn't be too much, and who is the judge going to rely on, the federal government or whom, as the expert. When you get to perception, there's plenty of literature on that, and we know, as our oyster farmers here know in our town, that as soon as the word is out that there's 1.1 million gallons dumped in the bay, the New York restaurants, the Washington restaurants, they aren't buying. And that is the end of the industry. Okay, thank you very much. Any questions? I'd be glad to answer.
Thanks, Mary. Again, we'll be taking the questions after all the presentations are done. And that was Mary Lampert from Pilgrim Watch. Again, pilgrimwatch.org is her website. I now have the pleasure of reintroducing Michel Lee, an attorney whose focus has been on the Indian Point nuclear power plant on the Hudson River. And Michel, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and I will endeavor to get your slides live, and hopefully have no further complications.
Oh, my slides, they always are a conundrum for and I know it's me. It's me.
Okay, hang on a second. That's not going to work. You can't see them. Let's see. We have had a little trouble with these, so bear with us, everybody.
Well, I'll have a plan B, which is a very different presentation if we don't have the slides.
Okay.
But I'll just say, first of all, thank you for Ian, for finally clarifying in my mind. Oh, good. Okay, we have it. Well, I'll just continue thanking Ian first. For the weak and strong thing with beta particles has driven me crazy, and now I understand it and can go forth and explain it to others. Okay, so I decided to be a little optimistic for a change of pace, and talk about what's going on in New York, because democracy it is sort of kind of working, and it's really been amazing. So next slide.
Having this issue of not being able to advance it, so 1 second.
Well, I'll start talking about the next slide.
Yeah. Stop.
Okay. Well, I'm back to me.
Yes.
So next.
Sorry.
Do you think you can get it?
You keep talking, and I'll keep trying.
Okay. So it shows a lot of beautiful pictures of a rally at the Hudson River. That was so last weekend. It was on May 6th, and what was rather exceptional about this rally, it was actually good. See how beautiful our Hudson is. This rally was actually the third rally we've had this year. The first one was in New York City. Another one was in Portland. This is This one was organized actually by the town of Cortland. So we have a rare situation now where the elected officials are pretty much in a bipartisan way on our side. So next slide. So you see it was a beautiful day, glorious weather. And on the right, that was my congressman talking. He actually comes from a little bit downriver, a little bit closer to New York City. But the congressman who represents the town where Indian Point is and where the discharge would be into the Hudson River gave a statement. At the rally, our senators Schumer and Gillibrand gave statements. And the key thing was there were a lot of elected officials speaking, which really shows that this thing has a little bit of momentum and that there's pressure being put on Holtec, which is of course the same company that is desiring to dump the river into the Hudson, into the Cape Cod Bay. So next slide. We actually have gotten media for change, not major media, but we've gotten a lot of local newspapers, radio stations, TV stations. They gave me an hour on a radio show last Saturday, so we're getting coverage. And this next slide. So you know, I've been in this now for over 20 years, focusing on issues with the environment. Before that, I practiced as a normal, regular litigator in New York City. And after 9/11, we had a huge, you know, outcry about Indian Point, since it basically was suddenly became clear to be a terrorist target and could have basically rendered the New York metropolitan region uninhabitable for generations. So that was the problem. But in the intervening years, it's been really hard to get people aware, other than, you know, the sort of wonks who focus on this stuff. But something about this wastewater dump into the Hudson River has absolutely energized people. And we were helped enormously by the path that was paved by our friends in Massachusetts, who went, you know, how to deal with this about a year ahead of us. So we benefited enormously from them. Just some other things that helped us mobilize really fast we've had years, 2 decades, different environmental groups. Anybody in the environmental area knows we don't always join as seamlessly as one would like, but something about this issue struck a nerve. Environmentalists came together and are coordinating and are really acting as a collective to try to stop this release. We're engaging with electeds, and I would say bugging and hounding them, but it's worked. And the final thing really is the issue itself. Again, there's something about the audacity of releasing water that's contained and doesn't have to be released. Next slide. So what we did is we did a whole series of forums, and this is just a bunch of the environmental groups that have been putting on forums together, just to give you a visual, but there are many, many, many more. Next slide. And what's been our main effort? Our main effort has been to sort of try to punch through the mentality that, oh, it's allowed by regulations. Now we're arguing it wouldn't be allowed by regulations, but that's a different story. The whole issue of regulations, people have to understand, and I'm an attorney, this I can pretty much speak confidently about. Regulations are not created to you know, just promote the public welfare, right? It's part of a political process. You have multiple stakeholders, and we all know that money and power and industry tends to get part of their way, if not their total way, when regulations are generated. And the regulations we're dealing with are from the 1970s. So we're dealing with incredibly old, outdated science. So one of the first things we wanted to do is really punch through and get the medical science out there, right? Because the regulations that relate to the release of radionuclides from power plants and from decommissioning plants basically are a physics and engineering-based science. Well, that's not all of science. So we had the wonderful, esteemed Helen Caldicott at our first forum, and she just gave she was amazing, as she always is. We had a whole bunch of other physicians. But anyway, so let's go to the next slide. This is a wonderful quote from Helen Caldicott, the first forum. So I'll just read it because I like it so much. Physicists talk convincingly about permissible doses of radiation. They consistently ignore internal emitters, radioactive elements from nuclear power plants that are ingested or inhaled into the body, giving very high doses to small volumes of cells. Okay, so what are the regulations essentially designed to protect? It came out of the Manhattan Project, right? Fighting World War II. And they were basically designed to protect young, white males, the people who were working in the Manhattan Project. They didn't consider women, really. They didn't consider children. They didn't consider toddlers or babies in utero. And they really didn't focus much on internal emitters. They focused on external dose. So the below thing I have here, it's just so astonishing. I had to put it in. And I put the words, not a joke, it's the real logo, because I showed it at a webinar last year, and people thought I did it as a joke. So this is the logo of Mothers for Nuclear, which is one of the front groups that's been out and about all over the place, and is a great proponent of continuing nuclear power plants. Its founder is an operator at the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in California. But I love the photo because it's a mother cradling the photo, the sketch, mother cradling her baby, and I'm sure, you know, all of us mothers just want to have our babies cradled and you know, absorbing as much radioactivity as they can possibly get, right? But this is exactly the kind of PR we have to fight against. Next slide. So there's, aside from the biological impact, you're talking about a vital waterways. Hudson River is a Superfund site, the largest Superfund site in the United States. So why is it a Superfund site? It's a Superfund site because back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, General Electric Company released radionuclides and PCBs into the Hudson River. So it's the PCBs that really were the focus, but it was all done under regulation. And the belief, as appears to be prevalent still today, is that dilution's the solution to pollution. So if you're just sort of like dribbling it into the water, it's not going to have any effect, right? Well, we now know that's nonsense. And tritium, which has been the most ignored of the radionuclides, we're now learning from more modern science, and these two papers are in the last couple of years, are suddenly emerging as much more concern than anybody really realized. And the truth is, next slide, there is very little research on this because the powers that be don't want to do research on this because it would really be a devastating blow to the nuclear industry, as well as, by the way, to the fossil fuel industry, because it would get more attention on the radionuclides that get emitted into the environment through fracking, and that's considerable, even though it's mostly different kinds of radionuclides. So we've been trying in the Hudson River to focus on the rights-based aspect of this. The public has a right to a clean river. Going back to Mary's point about the fishermen don't want a beer can thrown into the Cape Cod Bay. Our position in New York is we don't care if it's a teaspoon of tritiated water being thrown into the Hudson River. You don't have a right. This is the public's river. It is not the private sewer of the Holtec International Corporation. So no, thank you. If you love it so much, put it in your own private pool. And the fact that the Hudson River and the community has been dumped on enough. We are a major environmental justice area. The area where Indian Point is sited is also the site of a huge, it was an old industrial city. So you have all these, buried materials all over the place. It's a minority area, a marginalized community. And of course, Indian Point has been releasing radionuclides into the waterways since the 1960s. Now, what's different about a decommissioning plant from an operating plant is you don't have the same cost-benefit kind of argument that you do, right? We would argue against the conclusion of this argument, but at least with an operating plant, one can argue that there's some benefit to the public because you're generating electricity. Well, with a decommissioning plant, that's not the case. With a decommissioning plant, there's no benefit to the public. All the benefit is to Holtec's bottom line. And I should add that Holtec took over a $2.4 billion with a B trust fund from New York, which had been paid into by New York ratepayers, with the theory that after the plant was shut down, and the plant shut down finally in 2021, after the plant was shut down, it would be cleaned up by its operator, the one who made money from it over the years. And then what was left over would go back to the ratepayers. Well, that model went out the window when Holtec grabbed the money pot. So Holtec's entire profit model is to go forward, get as many nuclear power plants as it possibly can, and do lots of decommissioning really fast. I guess you would call this the dirty cheap approach. And by the way, something that's important to note is Holtec has never decommissioned a nuclear power plant. Never. It's going forward in this massive fleet approach, doing all these plants all at the same time, based on its newly sampled model of how if you do a lot of plants, you'll have learning. And well, this is like starting a fleet of airplanes when you've never built an airplane, right? But you're going to learn as you're flying them. So and by the way, there have been tons of violations already at these sites. Next slide. So this just is a good visual. It shows again the point that the Hudson River and of course many other waterways have been heavily, heavily burdened already. So if you're talking about what's good for human health and what's good for our ecosystems, that are already being challenged heavily by climate change. And you really have to have a holistic approach. And that's part of what we're pushing our public officials to try to have, right? A holistic approach, which takes into consideration, what's the real injury to people and river systems. And this is a photo taken some years back while Indian Point was operating, and there was also a coal plant on the lower left of the screen. But the upper right is Indian Point, which gave this enormous thermal plume. So folks talking about how great nuclear is for climate change, it's not for a lot of other reasons, but one major reason that's often neglected from consideration is how much it damages water. And water protection is one of the main things that people who are environmentalists and concerned about the climate are most, desire to protect. So why would you keep running these plants, destroying the water through heat, aside from radioactivity? Next slide. But then you would destroy it through radioactivity too. This is a NRC diagram of a legacy leaks from Indian Point. And those were mostly tritium, but also strontium and some other radionuclides. Most of the leaking came from two of the spent fuel pools, right? And a lot of the leaks went on for more than a decade without anybody even being aware of it. So when you're talking about how much tritium or other radionuclides go into the environment and go into area source waters, you have to always keep in mind that these things are leaking in ways that nobody has any idea really. So this was actually discovered when a worker during one of the shutdown maintenance periods, his boots were sloshing around in water, and his personal protective gear alerted the site that then run by Entergy to the problem that there was radiation on the site. Then it took years before they figured out how many leaks there were. It took years before they figured out where the leaks were going. And of course, all the leaks are going into the Hudson River, where they are still going because the leaks there is water that's it's not like all water. It's not like a huge body of water. What it is it's water that's trapped in rock and that's slowly seeping into the Hudson River. So next slide. So again, this is back to our little rallies and things. We're trying to get the point of whose voice counts. We want our public officials to listen to the communities and to the elected officials. Right now, our basic effort is being waged by bills that are being worked on as we speak in the New York State legislature that would directly prevent the release of the water from Indian Point into the Hudson River, and perhaps with a solution that one of the main ones that is come up with, but I'm not an engineer, I can't tell you what the best one is, but we want it to be kept on site. We believe it's an environmental justice issue to have it trucked off site. And there's also a risk, of course, if there is an accident or something in a transportation route. The next slide, I think, is my final. And then again, it's just our Hudson River is so beautiful. And why poison it more? So that's it.
Thanks very much, Michelle, for that presentation. And we will now go to questions. We've got it just under 20 minutes officially left, but if you're able to stay longer, we still seem to have our audience with us. So we'll take about 20 minutes of questions and see how we're we'll do a little check-in and see how we're all doing. So my colleague Paul Gunter at Beyond Nuclear has, while you've been presenting, looked into the Q&A. So Paul, why don't you give us the first question?
Thank you. We have a question from Courtney Williams. She says, I work in a biological laboratory and have used tritium as a lab reagent. Why are lab safety standards so high? There must be a zero detectability of tritium anywhere, but nuclear plants can dump it. So Ian, is that a question you would like to address?
I'll give it a go. When you say that the standards are so high, what do you mean is the limits are high? In fact, the standards are lax. Terminology, I know, but basically, if you've got a really high limit, then it means that you don't have much safety. So the question is really, why are the standards so lax? Well, so in other words, so poor. Essentially, it's political. Many of the limits were set, as somebody said, way back in the 60s, and they've not been changed since. And back then, the nuclear industry didn't really know about tritium, and certainly the NRC didn't. So that, and basically, they have not brought up to date what the limits really should be. Maybe I could give you an example of what happened in Canada about this. The Ontario government in 1994, as a result of public pressure, by the way, in Canada, they put out humongous amounts of tritium. The nuclear power stations put out huge amounts of tritium because their heavy water reactors are prolific breeders of tritium. Anyway, what happened was that in '94, the Ontario government set up a committee to look into the matter and recommend what the limits should be, including for laboratories, by the way. And it came up with a limit of 20 becquerels a liter. As you can see, it's on one of my slides, it's much lower, much stricter, a very good standard compared with what the standard is in the United States or in Canada. Anyway, the problem was that the nuclear power is so powerful in the province of Ontario that the Ontario government just said, we ignore it. You guys can just go away. We're not going to do it. So what happened was that again, 20 years later, there was an outcry about very high tritium emissions. The then Ontario government set up another committee called ODWAC, Ontario Drinking Water Advisory Council, which went through the same exercise, looked at all the evidence and recommend again 20 becquerels a liter. And you'll never guess what happened. The Ontario government again said, no, we're not listening to you. We're not going to implement these new safer standards. So in answer to the questioner, it's all got to do with politics. And until we get a situation whereby the politicians are willing to listen to our arguments, we're not really going to get very far. And I'm heartened by the discussion shown by both Mary and Michel about showing that they're really actively involved in taking this up with elected representatives, because that's where you get change. I'll leave it for that for the time being.
Could I
Okay,
add one
thank you.
point?
Go ahead, Mary.
One point I'll add is something that's very obvious here, that they know that they cannot filter tritium. They cannot stop the release into our waterways, period. And so therefore, there is a high motivation to pretend it is no problem. I know Holtec at the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizen Advisory Panel hired their own tobacco salesman to convince the public that tritium was of no harm. So therefore, don't worry, it will be released. We cannot argue against the fact it cannot be filtered, even though we are selling our point that the water is processed. Don't worry.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Del Dewar. She
Del Dewar.
says, I'm sorry.
Bill Dewar.
Okay. My question is about the example of upstream tritium. Am I understanding that the tritium that you put in the stream in your experiment was actually found upstream? Does this mean that the Japanese tritium could become worldwide? How quickly? And that's for you.
Yeah. Yes, it did go upstream. Yeah. Amazingly, it went upstream. Now, applying that to what's happening in Fukushima, well, the proposal there is to dump it into the, and this is going to be on the second presentation later on, probably in June, but the Pacific Ocean is huge. So would it travel throughout the Pacific? Well, yes, it would, but the dilution factor would be incredible. Now, I know you're going to say, well, dilution isn't the answer to pollution, and I totally agree with that. But the point is that the Pacific Ocean is pretty big. And if you were to ask me, does that mean that the water in the Pacific, which is reaching the shores of Western Canada and Western United States, would be contaminated from Fukushima? Yes, but you probably wouldn't be able to measure the difference. Just being brutally frank about it. The point is that, as I say, the Pacific Ocean is very large. But in theory, yes, it would travel. However, there are a bunch of other considerations to take into account. The point is that tritium does exist naturally in the biosphere because it's created in the upper stratosphere by cosmic rays hitting the atmosphere, hitting oxygen molecules and nitrogen molecules. And basically you're getting spallation, you're getting tritium being created in the upper atmosphere. And that results in a background level of about 5 to 6 becquerels a liter everywhere in the world. I'll repeat that. There's a background level existing of 5 to 6 becquerels a liter. Now, you may say, well, does that mean tritium is safe? No. And we're getting into an argument here about background. The point is that we get background from a variety of sources, from radionuclides in the soil, from radon in the air that we breathe in, and from radionuclides inside us. So the point being is that we have to learn and think about background level of radiation and radioactivity, and to be more informed about it. Like, one of the things that tends to happen is that the nuclear industry and the regulators use the fact of background radiation against us to say, you're worried about things that you shouldn't be worried about. No, we should be worried about background radiation to an extent. I mean, the point is that if you were to, we all, on average, depends on which country and where you live, get an average of about 3 to 4 millisieverts a year. Now, you can multiply that by the populations in a particular country and figure out the number of people who are going to die. in the future from those background levels. And they're not inconsiderable. But the point is, what we're talking about today is not naturally occurring radiation or radioactivity, but man-made radioactivity, which is a totally different thing. It's subject to political processes. Background radiation is not. So we do what we can against man-made radiation and man-made radioactivity, which is what we're talking about today. Sorry, it's a long answer there, but I thought I'd better get it out.
And Dr. Fairlie, there's also the other way that tritium travels, and that's through bioaccumulation and biomagnification, which again, it takes up that subject of tritium that's bonded organically in the environment. And I think that's one of the big concerns that, there's still much more research that needs to be added on to what we already know about this phenomenon of biomagnification and bioaccumulation.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if Mary or Ian or Michelle would have any comment on that.
I was going to add something about organically bound tritium, but
thank you. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay, is that okay, Michelle and Mary? Yeah.
Sure.
I didn't talk about organically bound tritium in my talk because I didn't have enough time, to be honest. What happens is that when we take in tritiated water by drinking it or eating contaminated food or by breathing it in the air, it goes to our body and it becomes trapped in organically bound tritium. In other words, it gets into our carbohydrates, it gets into our proteins, and it gets into our fats or lipids. And each of those have a reservoir in the body, and they stay for long periods in the body, much longer than the periods of tritiated water in our body. Tritiated water itself, just by itself, has got a transit time in the body of what they call a biological half-life of about 10 days. In other words, after 10 days, half of it comes out. But when it comes to organically bound tritium, no. It can last for years. In fact, if the tritium is bound to our DNA, and some is, it's there for life because DNA is very avidly conserved. The body protects DNA and it stays intact as long as possible. So DNA is a lifetime commitment. That's why we should worry about tritium getting into our bodies, because willy-nilly it becomes bound to our body. Now, there's a second part of what Paul said, and that is bioaccumulation as it goes up the food chain. Yes, that happens as well. It mainly happens through binding, through organic binding. But what tends to happen is that if you have high levels of tritium in the water near, say, the end of a pipeline, just for example, going out into the Pacific, then the lower forms of aquatic life, and by that I mean the algae, the bacteria, the viruses, they quickly become tritiated through the processes I mentioned earlier. And what happens is that small live, very, very, very tiny fishes, mollusks, snails, they become tritiated, and then of course the bigger fish eat those, and you get bioaccumulation all the way up to the top predator, whoever it may be, sharks or whatever. They become tritiated. So basically all life forms become contaminated. through organically bound tritium. And that's why we shouldn't really be putting tritiated water into the rivers. Now, I'm just going to finish off by saying this. And this is important for both for Mary and Michel, is that in any discourse with officials or regulators, with Holtec, God bless them, what you really, really, really need to get is information on what the concentration is of tritium in the water that they propose to dump. That's absolutely vitally important, because without that information, our hands are tied behind our back. Now, I've noticed, for example, with Holtec, they have been very reticent, and they have not, as far as I can see, divulged this information. But if there's a mechanism, freedom of information, for example, whatever, where you can get this data, then that will be useful for you in your court cases, or if there aren't any, or helpful to me in helping you. I'll finish there.
Thank you. Mary or Michelle, would you like to add any points to the whole issue of bioaccumulation, biomagnification, and or organically bonded tritium?
Well, I'll add 2 points, slightly different. Who's going to be getting, these things are released in batches, right? So where does it go? It goes right in the area, in the immediate point of the release. Holtec in New York originally wanted to release it at the beginning of the summer. Now they've pushed it to the end of the summer. But that's one of the major recreational periods of use of the Hudson River. And the beaches are right there. So you want to have small children, pregnant women, fishermen. So whatever the ultimate dilution is going to be, and whatever the ultimate bioconcentration is going to be, you're exposing vulnerable populations in a way that I think is incredibly unethical. So that's my one point. And by the way, this will travel right across the placenta, and right,
Yeah.
it's water. The other point is the focus over the years in the science has been almost exclusively on cancer. From at least the research I've done, which appears to now being a little bit corroborated by researchers who actually have medical degrees, including Mothersill group in Canada, has eliminated the fact that what happens in the body is not just getting cancer. You have a host of other illnesses that can be triggered, particularly when you have errant cellular signaling mechanisms. And so when you're looking at radionuclides, you have to start considering the other disciplines of medicine, bioenergetics, the microbiome, the newly developing electrome, which is actually looking at the impact of actually how electricity might be impacted in the body. I would think that would be something that in 20, 30 years might be one of the areas where scientists will find the most impact of radionuclides in the human body. That's a brand new branch of science.
Okay, it's difficult to respond to all of that, but I'll try. As regards,
could we have Ian? Could we have Mary? Could we have Mary respond first?
Yes, as far as bioaccumulation goes, when you start with the smallest creatures, and that we have the protozoan, etc., they have a large body surface, And because of the body surface being so large, they absorb more than if otherwise. But at the other point, and then it goes up the food chain as Ian described, winding up on our dinner plates. But as a result of it being on our dinner plates, you're going to run into the situation where these filter feeders that are so important to our ecology for cleaning up the water, the mussels, clams, etc. They're filter feeders, so they're bringing all that stuff in. But if nobody's going to be buying them, then this will remove the market, for example, for the oysters in our bay. And so they will not be planting 77 million seedlings, oyster seedlings in our bay, as they did before, which is an ecological service to clean up our bay as a consequence. And so I was also going to bring up the insufficiency of the licensee's environmental monitoring report. We have looked at the environmental monitoring reports since day one, and it is clear that they do not take enough samples. They mistakenly they mislabel control samples for which are actually media samples. They do not consider the age, the sex, and the size of the sample, which is relevant to the impact. And we do not get information of how much tritium are in the media. And so for all these reasons, although they throw out their environmental sampling to support the myth that we have been dumping all along, all the years of operations, and there's been no problem. Well, there's been no problem because NRC has allowed you to do an insufficient sampling. And so I'm grateful for Dr. Fairlie's suggestion of pounding and getting the actual figures of tritium in the water, which will be important also for EPA. Not only the state, because our state can look at both radiation and chemicals. EPA, although they've ceded the safety aspects of radiation to NRC, that doesn't mean that they cannot look at radiation, and particularly radiation in the water and how it's going to interact with their acceptable doses of chemicals.
Thank you. Dr. Fairlie, did you want to quickly wrap up this particular area of questioning?
Yeah. I feel bad about the fact that with Chesapeake Bay, where you've got an entrapped system, and you are, from what I gather from you say, there's a lot of oysters there. Were the oysters used for human consumption?
In Cape Cod Bay, I don't know about oyster. I don't know about Chesapeake. Yeah, I know you human consumption.
Sorry, maybe I picked you up wrongly. Sorry about that.
But
It's just that the discharge of tritium into Chesapeake Bay would contaminate, because it's essentially a closed system, all of the biota, aquatic biota in the bay, all of it. Whether it's eaten by humans or not, it would be contaminated, which is a sad thing. About discharges being in batches, well, by the way, that tended to happen when the plant was in operation. You'd have, what would happen is that reactors would be opened up to put fresh fuel in. And when that happened, very large amounts of tritiated water vapor would be discharged into the air, into the atmosphere, very large amounts, and though at high concentrations. And that is what, in my view, resulted in leukemias in the kids nearby. But in addition to the tritium in air, there's also tritium in the water. And this is what both Mary and Michel have drawn attention to. It's the tritium in the water courses, which is their concern. Yes, it is a matter of concern. And if they're going to be dumping this stuff into the river, then what you need to do is to object very strongly and demand what the concentrations are going to be and demand when they're going to occur. I think it would be wise, for example, for them not to occur during the summer, as you say, because that's when the major recreational uses occurs. So anyway, these are all issues which need to be addressed, I suppose, at in discussions with, as you call them, the elected representatives and with the regulators. By the way, I'll just finish off with this. I'm quite willing to speak to by Zoom or Skype or whatever to any of your elected representatives or to the regulators to bring them up to speed about tritium's dangers and to tell them that they really need to start worrying about tritium much more than they are at the present moment. Quite willing to do that.
Thank you. Along those lines, a sort of a good segue to the next question. Barbara Warren asks, particularly for Mary and Michel, but Ian, your contribution would be welcome here too. How involved have the medical and public health communities been around this issue with Pilgrim and Indian Point?
Well, and for example, the physicians for social responsibility have spoken about the dangers, in particular of tritium, having been invited by the Plymouth Board of Health, the various towns' boards of health have been talking to one another and to getting involved. And so, yes, they're definitely starting to get into this. I don't know, frankly, how many doctors, but I know every town on Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard voted opposing the discharge, as did the towns from the Cape Cod Canal going up through Marshfield and north and Situate. So there is considerable public concern, and the major concern obviously is the health and the economy. And so how many doctors, I can't give an answer, but I know the physicians for social responsibility are involved.
Yeah, we brought doctors to every forum we've done. We made sure we had our MD, our token MD, and also before the New York State Decommissioning Oversight Board, where I spoke about it. We brought in an MD. So but by the way, the rally that I showed in the first picture, the supervisor of Cortland, New York, who organized the rally, and he's on the Decommissioning Oversight Board, is an MD. So it is very much the perspectives of the MDs who have helped combat the perspectives of the physicists and engineers, frankly. Again, you're talking about disciplines where there's different, there's different training and different perspectives, right? The doctors are looking at it, particularly pediatricians.
And I'd say doctors tend to be politically conservative. That has been a problem.
Putting it mildly.
I'm being polite.
By the way, we're getting, and I can see we're getting to the end here, and I want people to realize that if they want more information about tritium's hazards, I've written a very long piece on my website, and the address is with my name, which you can see there, without the space between Ian and Fairlie, .org, O-R-G. And when you get there, just do a search for tritium, and you'll see a very lengthy piece called The Hazards of Tritium, which spells out in clearer detail than perhaps in what I've been able to say today, just why we should be worried about tritium.
Great.
So
How are
Paul,
we
do you
doing on time, Linda?
Well, it's almost 11:45. We've still got about 40 participants here. I did see there were some questions about Holtec, and I think we maybe do need to clarify, like, who are they, where have they sprung from, and how is it that a company that has sort of suddenly appeared in this arena with zero experience, as you said, about doing a decommissioning, got this contract in the first place? Yeah, I think there've been a few questions about, how could this be, but who are they? And they seem to have a little bit of a murky track record already in the projects that they've already been involved with. So does that help perhaps stoke concerns and skepticism in your communities about their suitability even to do this work, let alone what they're trying to do as far as discharging tritium into the Cape Cod Bay, into the Hudson River? Maybe we'll start with you, Mary. If you can lean in a little to your computer and speak up a little louder, because people have had a hard time hearing you well.
Oh, sorry.
But let's hear from you first about Holtec, and then we'll go to Michelle, and then Ian, if you've got something to add about how these nefarious corporations jump in the mix, please feel free to contribute also.
Their main selling point. First, people have to understand that Dr. Singh in New Jersey and Florida has no responsibility.
And Dr. Singh is who? Can you tell us?
He's the president of Holtec International. And that company in New Jersey, headquartered, that also produces the spent fuel canisters, is getting into SRMs, is looking for the interim spent fuel storage site. They've got their hands in a lot. They've done nothing on decommissioning, and they, who owns Pilgrim, for example, is Holtec Pilgrim Limited Liability Company, and the operator is Holtec Decommissioning International Limited Liability Corporation. So therefore, although NRC says if they get short of money, they can make Holtec New Jersey make it whole, that's wrong. You can't make a company that doesn't own something to be economically responsible. The bag will go on Massachusetts. They bought Pilgrim for about $1,000, period. And they expect, which we had in our motion to intervene on the sale, to get about $1 billion in profit. And that's for sure, because they're using, number one, the decommissioning trust fund that they never put a penny into for spent fuel management costs. And because the DOE, our government, did not honor the contract to take the fuel by 1998, the licensee can sue the DOE for spent fuel management costs every year until the spent fuel leaves the site, which they miraculously say will happen in 2064, based on nothing. So therefore, taking what they spent for spent fuel management costs, they say 500 million, just do the adding, rather 1,000, you add it up, and they will get $500 million from DOE that they can put in their back pocket, because we couldn't get in the settlement agreement that they would have to reimburse that money to the decommissioning trust fund. Then you add whatever is left over from the decommissioning trust fund, and you can get up, assuming the stock market recovers, to $1 billion, which is nice work for $1,000 investment. Then you have to look at what is their sales pitch. Their sales pitch is, we will do the decommissioning very quickly. And this is magic to the host community's ears, because they have depended upon the cow, if you will, the nuclear reactor, for their budget and finances. And with the reactor shut, they now want it cleaned up as quickly as possible so they can have other tax uses out of that property, and also get all the workers for decommissioning into the community to help ease the economic pinch they're feeling from not getting monies from an operating reactor. And so that is why citizen activism, litigation, everything we can do to stop the dump is taking time. And time is money to Holtec. And it wrecks their brand, which is, we will do it quickly.
Michel?
Just a few thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Mary said put it out very well. I will only add that the structure of Holtec has more shelves than Cape Cod Bay.
Indeed. And Ian, any final words before we wrap this up?
No, I can't really talk about Holtec.
Although we know there's a Holtec
my mum used to say to me, if you can't say anything nice about them, don't say anything. So I'm going to remain silent about Holtec.
Well, thank you for that. And we have noticed, though, that there is a Holtec UK, so we'll have to delve.
Oh my God, no.
Yeah, and they're over here, which is very intriguing. So we'll dig further into that. I want to first of all thank the three of you, Mary Lampert, Michel Lee, and Fairlie, for participating today and giving us your excellent insights. I also want to thank all the people who joined us and stayed with us. And as always, we apologize for not having got to all of your questions. There are always too many than time allows to answer. We will endeavor to capture the Q&A and, if possible, respond to any questions that are simple to answer in written form later on. But of course, you can stay in touch with our three speakers. As they mentioned, Ian Fairlie has an eponymous website, ianfairlie, all one word, .org. Mary Lampert is at pilgrimwatch.org. And Michel, I guess the best way to reach you, would that be through nirs.org? Or have you got
At this point, yeah.
That's the best way to reach Michel. So feel free to follow up with all of them if you have additional questions that you would like to ask. We will be doing a second webinar on tritium later this year, date to be and speakers to be announced. That will focus on the Fukushima water dump, which I know many of you also asked questions about today. That has been condemned widely, not only by fishermen and citizens of Japan, but by international communities, including Pacific Islanders and Marshall Islands, for example, who will feel the brunt of it, also by international marine scientists and physicists. So there's been an enormous amount of opposition to this. And we've heard threats of this dump over and over again for several years now, and it's always about to happen, but it does look now like it is truly about to happen in June, possibly. So we'll be watching that, and also the Los Alamos situation. Ian mentioned at the beginning, the biggest releases of tritium are through vapor. That's what is planned at Los Alamos, 100,000 curies from 4 containers. We're not sure if it would go all at once. This would obviously contaminate an indigenous community in the surrounding area that have already taken the brunt of the radioactive pollution from Los Alamos over the years. So we'll be looking at that more from an environmental justice point of view, but also from a technical. We'll have another sort of quick review of tritium and how it harms us. So we hope to see you in the audience with us again. Watch for an announcement on that. Again, many thanks to my colleague Paul Gunter for fishing out these excellent questions. Thanks to Michel Lee, Mary Lampert, and Ian Fairlie, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening, wherever you may be.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.